Welcome back to Pope's Projects and Project 818 SRX. Just a little springtime update. I've been busy, but I've been working on about 15 different things at the same time and not many of them are finished. We're going to touch on them all just to show you guys that I haven't been stalling and putting out a video every 6 months because I wasn't working on it. I've been working on it, just not finishing a whole lot of things. As you can notice, the big thing, the transmission is out, bumpers off, wheels are off. Yeah, that sucks. So those of you that have been following this build for a while, you might have remembered the video. I think I called it bad throwout bearing, ? I was making some weird noise when I would be engaging the clutch. More than, it sounded like the clutch slipping on the flywheel before it engaged, but it was just more pronounced. It shouldn't have been that loud. And I wasn't quite sure what it was. So I first started hearing that noise about a year ago when I did the first drive video. That was when I first encountered it. And I've been thinking about it ever since. And it recently occurred to me that I didn't check the pilot bearing. I didn't replace it. And I didn't check that the Mazda pilot bearing was going to be any good for the Subaru. And as it turns out, it's not. So, and I knew that before I took transmission out because I simply went online and looked at the inside dimension or the bore of the pilot bearing, and it's quite a bit larger on the Mazda. So the Subaru wouldn't have been engaging, it would have just been floating in the middle. Would that have explained the noises? I don't know, but I didn't really want to drive the car too much without a pilot bearing. Essentially, if the shaft isn't touching the pilot bearing, it might as well have not have been there. So I decided to go ahead and pull the transmission to inspect. I also found out where the noise was coming from. Okay, this transmission is what was in the car. Came from the 07 naturally aspirated Impreza that I scrapped for all the donor parts I needed. This is the clutch that was installed in that car. It's an Exidy clutch. Not sure if they were an OEM supplier or if that's just a OEM replacement. It doesn't appear to be an upgraded clutch. So it was just designed to hold 150, 160 foot-pounds of the non-turbo engine. It was never expected to live up to the rotary with that size of turbo. It simply was what I had and wanted to just get it rolling. The noise that I was getting when I was engaging the clutch was actually the springs right here. I believe I can show you a little bit. There we go. Right there. See if that's going to focus. It's not much, but there's a little mark, and they're all over the springs. And what it was is they were rubbing off the flywheel bolts. And the bolts were softer, so the bolts had taken a little more damage. Those were getting almost like they were mushroomed. They were folding over to one side. Because as the clutch would start engaging and spin, it would hit the bolts, and then as soon as it would lock to the flywheel, well, it wasn't spinning, they were spinning at the same time, so the noise wasn't happening, and the bolts weren't rubbing on the springs. So that's not great. Now, would that be a problem with an upgraded push style clutch like this is? Maybe not, maybe. I'm not sure how the springs change into push style clutch. I only have a upgraded pull style, and it's not going to be an issue. If you are running the Volks conversion kit for yours, there are a couple of guys out there doing this with the rotary engine and the Subaru transmission. I'm not taking any responsibility or liability on this, but you could run the flywheel bolts without the lock washers and maybe run Loctite. That would provide enough clearance. I don't know if a different bolt would help if you could get something with a smaller head, but it probably wouldn't be strong enough. So that would be the easiest way to make room for it. Again, maybe a different style clutch. If I show you on a straight edge just how much lower, let's see if I can, like, those springs are quite a bit up from the friction pad, or the friction disc that engages the clutch. So they actually sit recessed into the flywheel where the bolts are. This is a Spec Stage 3 pull type clutch, which is going to go with this transmission we'll get into in a little bit. And that one doesn't have that problem. The springs are actually recessed from the friction pad, so they don't go down in here at all. They're actually further away from those bolts, so I have no concerns of them hitting the bolts or a repeat of that noise. Now, when I took this apart, the main reason was I knew the pilot bearing was going to be no good. So let's just have a look at that. So here you can see this is the Mazda pilot bearing and the Subaru shaft, and you can see how that might be a problem. Now, as to transmissions, this is out of a JDM 1999 JDM STI RA. So kind of a rare transmission. It's one of very few 5-speeds that came from the factory with a helical limited slip in the front. They also have the DCCD, which all you Subaru guys know. I believe it's some type of electronically controlled center diff. It's irrelevant on the 818, so that'll get removed, maybe sold. I'm not sure what they're worth, but that's going to get removed. Another thing is this center diff is no good for the 818. Now, you can still convert it to two-wheel drive, the same as this one. The difference is in the oiling. And when I take these apart, I'll take some pictures of it. But from what I understand, this transmission gets all of its oiling through the center diff. So the center diff gets the oil in and the oil transfers on. So without the center diff flicking the oil, the rest of the gears aren't going to get any oil. So if you were to just use this, you'd be pooched pretty quick because you wouldn't be getting lubrication. Whereas this transmission, the newer style, the Phase 2 I believe they're called, with the thicker casting in the middle, they get to oiling, with this case, it oils on the top of 5th gear and then that spreads back. So I need to take this center diff housing and put it on this transmission so that we get proper oiling. And hopefully when I take that apart, I can see something of proof of that. That's just what I read on the forums. So let's hope that's the case. Another thing I'm going to do is, one of the guys noticed that just with a 20-minute track session, that the infrared gun, this thing was reading like 250 degrees. So they're getting quite warm. So what I'm going to do is, while I have this case off, I'm going to drill and tap it probably here or here, and just plug it for now so that I can add an oil cooler in the future. And by doing it up here, I'll be dumping the oil that comes out of the cooler right on top of 5th gear, I think is the one that's way back here. So that's the plan. So let's hope that the internet's right and this is going to bolt to this, and there'll be some evidence of how the oil is dispersed in the transmission. So unfortunately, after filming that, I had to go to work for about 3 weeks. But I'm back, and without further ado, let's tear these two transmissions apart and see if we can't make one usable one out of it. Okay, so here we have it. We got the center diff housing removed on both transmissions. This is your phase 2 and this is your phase 1. The only real difference is the phase 1 here has this 5th gear synchro cone stopper, it's called. But I have a phase 2 over there that also has it. That's off a 2002 WRX. So I'm not sure when they stopped using that and why, but it doesn't seem like it's going to overly affect things. The splines are the same, so they look different at the moment, but you take this guy off like that, and then the two-wheel drive conversion piece, which is this, that sits down and locks those two together, fits on. So basically, my understanding is this is your front wheel drive and this is your rear wheel drive, and you need to lock those together. Usually the center diff sits over them and then it controls the distribution. So we're just going to lock them together and force them to move at the same time, and it'll all go through the front wheels. So now let's have a look at the housings and why I'm going to use the phase 2 housing on the phase 1 transmission. Okay, once again, phase 2 on the left, phase 1 on the right. Now, 5th gear sits, see, I'm pretty good lighting here. This little guy right here actually fits in to the shaft that 5th gear is on. And that is how the bearings in that shaft are oiled, is through this little port. Now, if you look up, it goes through there, and we can look on this side, and it's basically a little tray. So your center diff in here spins, flicks oil up, falls in the tray, runs down the tray, and out through this hole down the shaft, lubing the bearings. So if we don't have a center diff, there's nothing to flick oil into there, and you're just gonna toast your tranny in no time. Now, this one, our phase 2, actually use 5th gear itself, splashing oil up here. The oil comes, stops on these little castings, drips down into this little case, and comes out the same style hole. And if you look on the other side, there's nothing going on. Whereas this one we can actually see right through. So there's your main difference. Now the little stopper, let's go over here, the cone stopper, this little guy, it will just clear this different style oil tray, I guess we'll call it, or oil catch in position. And this little thing right here, I don't know what it's called, but that's basically what locates the stopper, because if the stopper is out of position, you can't change gears. So it needs to be out of the way so that it can come up. So even though this transmission doesn't have one, the case has this little spot right here to position it, just like the old ones. So I guess that is probably because, as I showed you on the transmission over there, some phase 2s have the cone stopper. So that works out fantastic. Because we're not using the transmission as Subaru intended, we don't not having a center diff but still having the center diff housing, these little things of how the oil is supposed to go and how it's going to go now are things that I don't have a whole lot of faith that Factory 5 spent a lot of R&D on. We've noticed a number of things over the years that they just kind of dropped the ball. Like recently being noticed is the angle of the engine and how, that affects things. So we're not necessarily running the transmission at the same angle either. And because there's no center diff to take up the housing, and there's no center diff flicking oil, I wonder if under acceleration we're not getting a ton of oil going to the back of the transmission and starving the gears of oil. So if you look at, so this is the front side, so this would be the back, and this is where our cover plate goes on. So there's nothing keeping oil from coming this way. Now, it would obviously have to jump up over this, but we're talking slosh and acceleration. There's oil back here. So it gets back here, and this could fill up to here, and then oil stay at that level. So even though you filled your transmission and you're confident you put the right amount in, do we really know the right amount? Did we have oil back here when we did that? If under acceleration, I mean, we could have oil ramping up back here and not being on the front gears. There's no way for it to get back. So my plan is to actually, not so much from there, but we'll look under here, is I'm going to open up all in here and in here with a die grinder so that any oil back there can flow to the front. Another thing is on the phase 2 transmission, the only passage to the front is this hole and this hole, which about half of this opening, if you can see there, because it's got that little rib in the bottom, that's the only way for the oil to get from the back to the front. So if we get a ton of oil in the back, I don't know that it's getting to the front fast enough. And this side, I got all this one open. There's a much smaller rib here, and of course that hole. So in my phase 1 transmission, I'm going to get a whole lot more oil to the front, which means that I am fairly confident that if I tap a hole right up here, I can do an oil cooler and return there, as opposed to splitting the case. I think if I had a phase 2 transmission going in, I would either use the speed sensor hole, which would involve having to split the case, or split the case and tap a hole so that I can get the oil back into here for the rest of the gears to pick up on. But I feel that I can transfer enough oil. If I'm flowing through with the oil cooler, the oil coming in, and oil will be splashing on 5th gear here, then it would come down, and there's an easy way for it to get through there. And under acceleration, the oil will go to the back, but it would have no problem flowing through here right after. And I just think the whole system will just work better. You guys can let me know what you think if I'm completely out to lunch on this, but I'm feeling fairly confident now, seeing the 2 transmissions apart. And I think this is the way to go. So I've ordered an oil cooler. I'm going to get a tilt-in pump off of Summit. Another wild idea I had that maybe someone else would do, I'm going to go ahead and not bother with it right now, is on the phase 2 transmission, if you fill these holes in here and you weld a cap in here, you could probably fit the tilt-in pump in here, which would make it a hell of a lot quieter, and actually have the oil pump mounted in the transmission. So that's a cool thought. So I'm going to do some die grinding, drill some holes, tap some holes, reassemble this, slap some paint on it, and hopefully I can get this transmission installed real soon. So as you can see, this is going to be my return port for my oil cooler. I threaded it all the way in and then ground it flush and smoothed out the edge there. The clearances are kind of tight to the case, so I didn't want it to protrude in through it all. And down here you can see my new holes. This is so that any oil that gets to the back of the case will have no problem flowing forward and not get trapped in the back useless, because there's no center diff spinning around in here. So we don't need oil pooling back there anymore. So it's not going to. So I think I have the last piece of the puzzle to putting this transmission in the car. I've got all my new clutch fork and pin, and I got my throw-up bearing for the Spec clutch installed. I've got new axle seals. I even put a fresh coat of paint on it because I had some time. I've got my port put in here for my return when I do add a oil cooler. I even have a cooler, just don't have it mounted yet. So the last thing I was waiting for, originally I was going to try to find a new pilot bearing to match up the Subaru shaft to the pilot bearing on the rotary. Here you can see the difference. This is the RX-7s or the rotaries clutch alignment tool. Here's the Subarus. So we can see the input shaft on the Subaru transmission is much smaller. So I couldn't find a proper bearing, and then it occurred to me, well, I just need to make this bigger. So instead of getting something machined, I went on eBay and found what I thought would be the perfect spacer. This is a 12mm outside diameter, and so is this. Unfortunately, it just fits like that. And it never occurred to me that I actually want it smaller than 12mm so that it would be a press fit, so I would bring this up to the proper size. So I had my buddy machine this little guy. So that's I'm going to heat it up and then press it onto here, and that's going to make that the same size. And I can also use it on my clutch alignment tool. I had to sand this down because it should be a tight fit, but see, now we're the same size. In case anyone's wondering, there are different spline counts, so I couldn't just go ahead and use the Mazda 1 on the Subaru clutch. So that's the plan. I'll install the clutch and then I'll heat this guy up and press it on there, and I should be able to finally install this transmission. Just want to quickly show you guys before I install it. I made this transmission mount from a stock one probably 3 years ago now. It's documented on my build thread on the Factory 5 forums. But there's only about a 1/4 inch or less of rubber or urethane in here versus like 1.5 inches there. I think there's 1.25 inches. Yeah, 1.25 inches the difference. So that's how much lower the transmission is. So just a simple mod guys can do. It can also help with the angle of the engine if you're modifying that on the Subarus. Well, there it is, installed. I stopped filming when I was installing it. I was getting pretty frustrated. I didn't realize that when I first installed it I actually bumped the little retaining ring off the pressure plate. So I didn't know that I had done that, and I was trying to install it, and I put a lot of force on the fork in order to push the throw-up bearing into that little retaining clip, which was actually just floating on the shaft, so I ended up bending the tangs on the throw-up bearing. So I had to pull the whole thing out, re-bend those tangs back in, reinstall that retaining ring, and then very gently put it back in. But it's in, The new slave cylinder is bled. That was also a huge pain in the ass. If you ever have to change your slave cylinder, do what they call bench bleeding it. So make sure that you fill it with fluid and pump some fluid through it. It's just gonna make your life a lot easier. So then you got a lot less air bubbles instead of just trying to get all the air bubbles out of here. Also, don't bleed it installed because the nipple is not the highest point. So I actually just hung it from the ceiling here. Anyway, it's done. It seems to be engaging and disengaging properly. We'll find out hopefully in a week or two when hopefully I drive the car again. But I'm going to cut the video here. I did say I was going to show some other things, but I'm sure this video is already going to be 20 minutes or more. So I've got some other stuff filmed and I'll put together another video really soon on all the other things I'm doing. So once again, thanks for watching. If you appreciate anything I've said or you're listening to this point, do me the favor of subscribing and hitting the like button. Until next time, peace.